What if we lived in a world where after the Second World War, a brand new species just randomly one day appeared on Earth? We learned from multiple sources that it's harmless, beneficial even, so we start incorporating it into our routines, our daily lives, even our food. Something feels a little off, but maybe it's just in your head. Welcome, and today we are going to be deep diving into the YouTube horror series Vita Carnis. This is going to be a pretty long video, so maybe grab a drink, grab a snack, hunker down, and let me walk you through the craziness that is Vita Carnis. The creator Darian Quilloy actually set up a playlist on his channel, which will of course be linked below, of all the videos in the order that they quote unquote should be watched in. So that's the order that we're going to be going through them today. And as always, I highly recommend that you go watch the playlist. It's not that long, maybe like an hour, 20 minutes tops. I think it is, of course, a very well done series. I wouldn't be talking about it if I didn't love it with all of my heart. But if you kind of don't really want to watch all the videos and you just want to watch this one, that's totally fine. I'm going to explain to you as best I can so that you understand everything that's going on in this crazy, crazy series. But of course, going back to the original source is always better, so it will be linked below. The first big chunk of videos is really just a documentary, and it opens up with a classified material warning screen telling us that viewing this information or even distributing it can lead to jail time or a $500,000 fine. We're then faced with the quite shocking information that starting in 1931, a brand new species randomly appeared on Earth, and they're changing everything we know about evolution, which is why the National Living Meat Research Foundation started. And they're conducting all of these studies to try to help us as humans better understand the Vita Carnis. The narrator tells us that the Vita Carnis are very similar to mammals. They're made up of flesh and organs and bones, and that the Carnis family is actually broken up into different species. So the following videos that we're about to watch are going to be breaking down each one of these species in more detail. Feel free to follow along on my Wendigoon-esque whiteboard that I randomly decided to buy for this video. We'll be going from left to right, so if you want to follow along, feel free. The first species in the Carnis family is the Scandoray Carnis, or otherwise known as the climbing meat, but it's more normally known as the crawl. So this creature is described as kind of looking like a human intestine, but the inside of the crawl is made up of a lot of veins and arteries, and these are used to absorb nutrients through the soil. But what I think is kind of interesting is that they also use photosynthesis, much like a regular plant would. We learned that once the crawl dies, it decomposes into very nutrient soil, which, as you could guess, causes much more plant life to grow wherever the crawl was. And then because there's more plant life, there's more animal life, and then of course the bigger animals come to eat the littler animals, and then once the animals die, they decompose, and this is very good for the crawl because then the crawl can grow well. We could tell almost right away that there's a mutualism between plant life and the crawl, but this is also true, we learn, for humans and the crawl. We see that humans have begun to use the crawl in a controlled environment to create fertilizer, and this really boosts the amount of crops and the quality of the crops that are being grown. The narrator also tells us that crawl is safe for humans to eat, although it's not really made its way into mainstream cuisine quite yet, just because it doesn't look very appetizing and it doesn't have a great taste. So even early on within this video, we can see some cracks in the narrative being told. For example, something that I noticed is that every time an image of a building was shown, it looked very run down and abandoned and covered in what I thought at first was plant life. But then when the narrator is talking about the almost supernatural growth rate of the crawl, there's a little glitch on the screen, and if you go frame by frame, we can see that there's a newspaper article stating that the crawl have actually taken over a radio tower. So in my mind, there's definitely two different agendas happening within this documentary now, because we can see that the narrator's just telling us how great the crawl is, how amazing, there's nothing bad about it. But then if we read between the lines, the crawl are causing havoc because they're taking over the radio tower, and now looking back on those abandoned buildings, maybe it's not plant life that's taken over and made these buildings abandoned. Maybe it's actually the crawl that are causing people to either have to leave the area or find somewhere new to live. It's just very interesting. But of course, We'll get into that a little bit more later. We will move on now to the second creature in the Carnis family, and that is the Vita Carnis, or the cowardly meat. And it's better well known as the trimmings. We learn right away that when the crawl is living in a very densely populated area, sometimes it'll grow these little nobules off the side of them, and then when the little bulb thingies fall off, it grows into these creatures called the trimmings. All trimmings are made out of flesh, and they can grow up to about 8.7 inches within their lifetime, and they can reach adulthood by about 7 months. We learn that their general appearance can vary, like the number of legs they have, maybe the way that their face looks, but they are described as looking like a skinned raccoon. So, you're welcome for that little image that I put in your mind. The trimming does have a lifespan of about 2 to 4 years, and they're known as scavengers, so they feed off things like plants and small animals. But the reason that they're known as cowardly meat is because they're just scared little guys. They kind of just hide, run around, and scream. And because of all this, they're kind of naturally found at the bottom of the food chain. We also learned that humans haven't really found a good use for the trimming quite yet. They're kind of known as pests because, much like a raccoon, they kind of just dig through the trash cans and scream. But other people have embraced these misunderstood little guys and have actually brought them into their home as pets. When the narrator is talking about the trimming population, we see a little glitch in our video, and if we go frame by frame, we can see that we get another newspaper clipping that's talking about how randomly, for an unknown reason, 400 trimmings actually gathered below a satellite dish. So at this point, I'm gathering that whatever the Carnis species really is, they are attracted to our modern forms of communication. And whether they're just trying to learn more about it, or if they're trying to meddle with it in some way, it's unknown. We'll just have to wait and find out. Moving right along, the next species in the Carnis family is called the Vita Carnis, otherwise known as borrowed meat, or the meat snake. So obviously this creature resembles a regular snake, and it has this transparent coating around it that reminds me of like an exoskeleton, and this holds everything together, but it also makes up their brain and their nervous system. Another fascinating fact about the meat snake is that within this coating, there's just this fluid that keeps the flesh inside of it from decaying, and it also makes the snake immune to all types of diseases. When the meat snake is born, it's just a measly little 7 centimeters, but within its lifetime, it can grow up to 16 feet, and in very specific conditions like war or some sort of mass casualty, it can grow even bigger. There's no set amount for the meat snake. Just whatever it can eat, it can keep growing, so that's kind of terrifying. Kind of going along with that, there's no set lifespan for a meat snake. It kind of just depends on how much food it can eat, but the oldest recorded meat snake was 28 years old. That's a full-ass adult meat snake. And how this species is different from every other in the Carnis family is that it can actually reproduce. So once the meat snake gets to a large enough size, it basically does mitosis and splits in two, and then there are 2 uniquely different meat snakes that can just go on their way. The meat snake is also the first species that we've talked about so far that doesn't live everywhere in the world. It can't really withstand very high heat or very cold temperatures. Let's talk grub. So the meat snake only eats decaying flesh. So if you're alive, you don't really have to worry about this guy getting to you in any way. But how it hunts is that it has a tongue-like organ with these little sensors on it, and it can pick up decaying flesh particles in the air, and it kind of uses this to guide it to food. And then much like a normal snake, once it finds its food, it'll just unhinge its jaw and swallow anything whole. The bones and meat are pushed through the digestive tract and then just kind of added on to the back half of the meat snake's body, which increases its size. What I find the most fascinating about the meat snake is that, kind of like a snail, you know, they'll like replace their shell every once in a while. The meat snake does the same, but with its skull. So if you look at the front of the meat snake, you can always tell what it recently ate because it will have that skull on its head. So much like the trimmings, meat snakes are pretty easy to tame, and because of this, humans have found a way to use meat snakes to their advantage. They're used in places like butcher shops, and they're used on the sides of the road to clean up roadkill, and they're also used after wars to kind of be the cleanup crew, if you will. This is kind of the perfect relationship because the meat snake gets to eat as much as it possibly can, and the humans basically get free labor. You know the drill by now, as the narrator is telling us about how the meat snake can grow much larger than its measly 16 feet in the right conditions. We get a glitch in the video, and if you go frame by frame, we can see that there's another newspaper article, and this one is talking about how a giant meat snake was found, and it was 130 feet. It appears that after the war, people were searching in these underground tunnels, and this is where they found this meat snake, and we learn that on the other half of the tunnel, there was a giant pile of bones. Whoever wrote this article seems to think that the meat snake was feeding off the bodies that were just accumulating during the war, and part of this article is redacted, but there is one highlighted thing in this article, and it has to do with cult activity. So at this point in the story, it's kind of hard to tell what this really means, but my best guess is that there was a cult maybe worshiping the meat snake and giving it bodies as offerings or something of that nature. Moving right along, we have the Vita Carnis, otherwise known as butchered meat or mimics. And this is the first one in our lineup that actually scared the living fuck out of me, so yay. Also, I just want to point out that if you've been around for a while, you know that I don't like mimic things. I don't like the skinwalker thing. It freaks me the fuck out. So right away, the narrator tells us that the mimics really just look like skinless humans with exaggerated features, and they just have to talk about the toothy grin. Which, I hate a toothy grin. Don't come near me with that toothy grin shit. And the narrator also has to point out that the mimic's not really smiling, it's just the way that its face is made. Fucking lovely. And while we're on the topic of teeth, we learn that the mimic mainly has canines and incisors, which is perfect for tearing up human flesh. The mimics exclusively live in densely populated areas, of course, because this is where the food is. And this creature is separated into 3 different life stages that we'll go through. In the first one, they are very small. They kind of look like little trimmings, actually. And during the baby mimic stage, they're mainly just eating like small rodents, little animals, and things like that. We'll move on to the next stage of the mimic's life, and it's at this point where they look like the description I gave earlier, and they start looking for bigger prey, and because of this, their hunting style really changes drastically. So they'll move to the densely populated area, and they'll start wearing human clothes and trying to blend in, and they can hide in very small places like in furniture. Amazing, so good. I love it. Once a mimic locks onto their target, they will start following them and observing their daily patterns, their routines, trying to determine when the human is going to be the most vulnerable. And this is usually when they are asleep. The narrator states that at this stage in the hunt, the mimic will wait till the human is asleep, silently creep up on them, kill them, and eat them whole right there. It will then move to a less densely populated area to kind of rest and digest its food before going back for another one. The hunting and feeding pattern does look a little bit different if the prey is awake during the hunt. The mimic will try to lure the human, usually through things like familiar sounds or speech. It will then corner the human and attack them that way. Now this video is different from the others because at some point things kind of glitch out and we actually get a POV of somebody presumably being hunted by a mimic. They dash through different rooms, closing and locking the door behind them before they eventually decide to hide within a closet. We can hear something violently banging on the door, then all of a sudden everything goes quiet except for the heavy breathing of the person filming and the uneven footsteps of something getting closer. I have to stop here and say that it was at this point in the series that I was completely hooked. Like, I was in it for the long run. Something about that face, I was like, I'm terrified and I have to know more. But anyway, after all that, we cut back to the documentary where the narrator is telling us about the final stage of the mimic. So if the creature is able to hunt and get enough food, it starts to take on more and more realistic human features, which of course makes it easier for them to hunt and kill. That being said though, if the mimic eats too much food, it will develop into an elder mimic, which is a definite hard no for me, thank you. It will start to lose its humanistic features and everything just becomes more exaggerated. The face of the creature will now be covered in this pinkish colored skin, and its grin will just become wider and wider, and its teeth will move more like to the back of its throat, leaving it just like a toothless smile. At this point, the mimic is considered the most dangerous predator in the entire world, which is why multiple governments have put out warnings and how-to guides on how to avoid a mimic attack. 1. Avoid going outside alone, especially in mimic-heavy areas, and especially if there have been recent sightings in the area. 2. If you encounter a mimic and they don't appear to be hunting, try to leave the area as quietly as possible and alert authorities. 3. If you're being hunted, try to get in a position where you could potentially run. Usually a mimic is smart enough that if they see that you have a potential getaway, they will avoid attacking. 4. If you're in a vulnerable position and you have no escape route, get into the fetal position and try to cover your head and your vital organs and make as much noise as possible. 5. Don't use weapons, even guns, because the mimic will not go down easy and you will not have time to kill it. Instead, use any weapons you have as more of a barrier to protect yourself. 6. If you know a mimic is hunting in the area, try to hide behind furniture or under a bed, because usually the mimic won't stick around trying to look for you. They'll just move on to better options. We then suddenly cut back to our found footage tape, and this time our camera is facing the wall and we just hear this feral gurgling sound of a mimic feeding. Blood splatters against the wall, and by now we can tell that whoever was filming this video is now dead. This is just a theory, so don't come at me, but it seems like if we're looking at our found footage, that the person that was being hunted was following pretty much all of the instructions to a T. It appeared like the camera person was trying to find a getaway route, trying to run, and that kind of worked at first, but then once they realized that maybe that wasn't the best plan, they decided to hide. But of course, we know that this didn't really work out for the camera person. But to play devil's advocate, it could just be that the mimic was actively hunting and they just had finally cornered them in that closet, and either way, the camera person wasn't gonna make it out alive. I just find it interesting because this is the first video in the series where the National Living Meat Research Foundation, the people that made this documentary, they aren't trying to spin it as like, this is a beneficial thing. The Vita Carnis are great for us. Like, they are truly trying to be like, here's the information you need to know. These are dangerous creatures. Do not fuck with them. Moving on, the harvester, or the Congregator Carnis, which means gathered meat, is the next little species we're going to be talking about. And they are basically just a giant crawl. When the growths don't break off of the trimmings, they just continue to grow into this giant bulb, and this is what the harvester is. And they are pretty big. They can grow up to 9.9 feet tall and 6.6 feet wide. So these are big boys. The big bulb of the harvester is what stays above ground, but underground there are these tendrils, and they can extend up to 492 feet. There are actually two types of tendrils. The first ones are very flat and they grow close to the surface. The narrator describes these appendages as kind of looking like a bear trap. From the tendrils, there are these spines, and within the spines, there are veins that pump two different types of venom. The first type of venom is actually a neurotoxin that will paralyze, and the second venom is actually an anticoagulant that will thin out blood. When there's any kind of movement above these tendrils, the spines will clamp on and start pumping the two types of venom into whatever happens to be there, whether that's humans, animals, anything, it'll clamp on. So now that the prey is basically paralyzed and bleeding out, this is where the second set of tendrils come in, and their main job is just to absorb nutrients. These tendrils will come closer to the surface and suck up any blood, any fluids that happen to be soaking out, and then these tendrils will actually wrap themselves around the prey and drag them underground. The entire corpse is then used up for nutrients, which of course helps the harvester grow, and because of this, the soil around this creature is very, very fertile, so you'll usually see a lot of plant life around a harvester. The narrator tells us that although coming across a harvester is relatively rare, the mortality rate is 100%. The only way to really avoid being killed by a harvester is to follow the posted warning signs. But just to be safe, we do get to learn how to react if we are in the presence of a harvester. So the best course of action is to stay as still as possible, but throw any heavy object you might have, like a backpack or a full water bottle, as far away from you as possible and towards the harvester. This will activate the tendrils on that heavy object, and then you should be able to slowly shuffle away. And then once you feel like you're a safe distance, if you have another object, you should throw that as well, just because those tendrils can extend for so long that it's better to be safe than sorry. Of course, during this video, we get a little glitch, and within this frame, there's a newspaper article talking about how a family was actually attacked by a harvester and how the authorities are refusing to take care of the problem. So we can obviously tell that although the narrator says that these creatures are relatively rare, attacks are happening. This threat is not zero. Looking at our list here, the next species we're going to be talking about is the Vita Carnis, the Empire of Flesh, or otherwise known as the Host of Influence. So the host is made up of a faceless head, a torso, and arms, and the bottom half of its body is made up of tendrils that extend into the ground, but it's important to note that it can unroot itself and kind of like move to different areas. Its back is covered in pores. These pores have within them these little barrel-like structures, and these release spores into the air. These spores are incredibly dangerous for humans, and they can be carried very easily by the wind. If these deadly spores are inhaled by humans, it can cause a multitude of symptoms, including numbness, sluggish movements, restlessness, and loss of consciousness. These will eventually worsen into things like dizziness, trembles, migraines, and impaired speech. If the human isn't treated within 6 to 7 hours, they will just stop whatever they're doing, get up, and start walking to whatever host released these spores. Once they get there, they will basically kneel down in front of the host, and then the host will gut them, kill them, and eat their organs. But thankfully, there are a couple ways to avoid being killed by a host. If the victim doesn't make it back to the original host in 36 hours, or if their symptoms are treated, they can usually make it out alive. Yay! Next, we're going to be learning about the Vita Carnis, which translates to sky or heaven meat, and they are better known as the monoliths. We almost immediately learn that the monoliths one day just showed up in a redacted place in June of 1982. There are 7 known monoliths, and they are all located within a mile radius of each other, and they're arranged in a circular pattern surrounding a redacted thing. From the neck down, the monolith's body is made up of these tightly wound, meaty fibers, and then the head of the monolith is just a meaty mass in the shape of a triangle with a hole in the middle. We learn that the monoliths don't really do anything. They just kind of stand there, except for this one time. And during this one encounter, they became extremely aggressive. We hear something about a group of people trying to make their way into a city, but that when they passed the monoliths, they began to roar and swing their little meaty rope arms. None of the group made it out alive, and later a military vehicle arrived, and again, the monolith began to roar, and there was an EMP blast so loud that it knocked over the truck. It seems like we went from 0 to 100 because then the military decides to just launch a rocket straight at the monoliths. And then we get to see footage of what is presumably this rocket launch. The narrator does tell us that although the monolith took damage, it healed itself very, very quickly, and now this entire area is restricted. We then move on to the final species in the Carnis family, which appears to be a sphere of some kind, but before we can really learn anything about it, the video glitches out and we get an outro message from the National Living Meat Research Foundation thanking us for our time and watching this documentary. I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you guys just a few little smidgens of background information. We do later find out that this species is called the Vita Carnis, which means truth meat, and that they are also known as the singularities. All right, so now that we have a better grasp on the Carnis species as a whole, let's move on to the other videos within this playlist. And these are basically just like random assortments of videos that help kind of build the universe up and give more context to the world happening around the Vita Carnis. Our first video is called The Cook at Home Kitchen, and it's basically kind of like a how-to video on how to cook with crawl and how to use the Nutrier Co. flavor enhancer. At first, this kind of seems just like your regular cooking show, besides, of course, the fact that we're using crawl as an ingredient. But there are a few very important things to point out within this video that you might not catch on your first watch. Let's start with probably the most obvious thing, and that is the chef's outfit. Throughout this video, we can see that they're wearing this full protective black suit, rubber gloves, and at some points we catch a tiny glimpse of the chef actually wearing a gas mask while he's cooking. Another thing to note is that when the chef is cutting up the crawl, at some point the music just completely drops out and we just get this gross sound of the crawl being cut up, and it's all bloody and it's kind of like mushy and gross. And then further on in the video, when the flavor enhancer is being added to the top of the dish, the music becomes really loud and distorted.
At this point, finish preparing the dish with your flavor enhancer, but allow your dish to cool to a temperature below 60 degrees Celsius.
And so just from watching this video, we can tell that this flavor enhancer definitely is more than just a regular spice, and we'll get into that more as we keep watching the videos. Our next video is the guide to owning your very own pet trimming, and I'm just going to run through the very basic facts from this video. We're not going to spend too long on it, although it is a great little video. First, we'll talk about kind of the environment that your pet trimming should be in. They are most comfortable when they're living at a temperature of about 18 to 20 degrees Celsius, and they also like to be in a warmer environment when they're sleeping and nesting. Your trimming can eat a diet of dog food or cat food, but they also like little scraps. They'll really eat anything, as we know from our little documentary that we watched. And also, they need lots of good exercise, they need stimulation, and they also need social interaction with other trimmings. So it's nice if you can like get together with other trimmings and let them interact with each other. They do like that a lot. The next few things are very important to note in the grand scheme of our story. For entertainment, the trimmings like to push and pull things. They're a big fan of that. But also, they enjoy watching TV and listening to the radio. They love that shit. And they also really like affection. They like pats, they like scratches, all that good stuff. But what they like the most is when you talk to them. And the narrator in this segment tells us that you can tell them about your day. You can tell them about anything. And to me, this sticks out like a sore thumb because we know that the trimmings have gathered randomly by a satellite dish. We know that they kind of like the gossip. We don't know why, but they really are kind of using humans for intel for some purpose or another. Our next video is called Meat Snake Specimen, and this is just telling us a little bit more about what we saw in that random little newspaper clipping about that giant meat snake that was found underground. So we learned that in 1944, World War II ended, and underground they found this giant meat snake. And they noted that it was a very odd color. It wasn't this bright red, but it was more of like a dark maroonish color. The people that discovered this giant meat snake also noted that it wasn't moving around like it normally did. It seemed kind of like lethargic, and it seemed almost like it was stuck in this underground tunnel. And the worst thing, they noted that the smell wasn't the normal meat snake smell, which is obviously decaying flesh. I mean, that's its diet. It's gonna smell like flesh. But instead, this particular meat snake smelled like freshly cooked scrambled eggs, which I don't know why, kind of makes me gag a little. Can you imagine just discovering one of the worst things you've ever seen in your life, and it just smells like scrambled eggs? A skin sample was taken from this meat snake, and it was found out that they could sustain extremely hot and cold temperatures, as well as quite a bit of radiation as well. It's also important to note that a different cleanup crew went to the other side of the tunnel and found the other side of the meat snake, and there were just piles of bones everywhere. Up until this point, I've tried to kind of just summarize these videos, but this next one, I'm gonna have to kind of deep dive into just because there's so much information. This video is called the Mimic Defense Instructional Tape, and we open up learning that this particular video is an emergency warning because as of 10/23/1986, there's been a global outbreak of missing persons, and this is due to the increase in mimic population. This video is really just to give people more information and examples about mimics to help them better understand and protect themselves. So we get examples of mimics hiding within furniture, which we learned a little bit about in the documentary. Horrifying. We also see how mimics can use more like human features to blend in. And then of course, in true Vita Carnis style, there's a little glitch within this part, and we see the mimics in their true form with the Latin word abbreviatus, which from what I understand means chosen. And again, don't really know what that means, but I'm terrified, of course, nonetheless. In this video, we learn that if we should encounter a mimic, we should maintain eye contact with them, make ourselves appear larger, and just make like a lot of noise. We learn that if we have a weapon like a gun, we should use it, aiming for the head and the legs, and we should try to fight back if we're attacked, or stay hidden or stay put if the mimic hasn't noticed us yet. We then cut to black and we hear the sound of a VCR tape being pulled out and another one being pushed in. And we see that this is an evidence tape from somebody named Christopher and Janice Grady from 1983. We then cut to the footage of the Grady siblings, and it appears that they're going on a little adventure of some kind and they're filming it. We can tell that Christopher is like super enthusiastic and Janice is just there because she was the only one available to go along. As they're trudging along, we get some information that they're actually traveling to the scene of a crime that happened a little while ago. And then once they get to that destination, Janice starts filming Christopher, and they're doing like the whole YouTube thing where he gives us more details from this story. As Christopher begins to read from his script, a confidential bar appears on the screen, but we can still make out what he's saying. He explains that in 1980, a teenager named Vincent came back to his trailer park after a long day and found his father deceased. Of course, the authorities were called, but nobody was allowed on the scene. They kept everything very hush-hush and almost immediately declared it a suicide. After filming a few takes, the siblings start to head back, and as they're walking, Christopher says that this would be the perfect environment for a serial killer to come and attack them. And then this happens.
Chris? Where are you? Chris! Come on! This isn't funny! Chris! I just want to go home, come on! Fine, I guess I'm going home without you.
Without a response, Janice just decides to keep walking, and then we see a little redacted bar, and as Janice pans up the camera, we finally see, behind a beat-up old car, our first full-body shot of a mimic. She obviously starts running and screaming for help. She finally makes it back to her house where she shuts the door behind her, but unfortunately the mimic is able to get in, and our last little shot is the mimic attacking and killing Janice. All right, let's break this down a little bit, okay, because there's a lot to go through in this one. So let's start off with the first portion of this video, because we're getting a lot of mixed signals. If you guys remember from the National Living Meat research documentary, they're telling us basically the exact opposite information from what this new emergency video is telling us. At first we were told to never use weapons, to make yourself as small as you physically can, and this new video is basically the exact opposite directions. So which one is correct? Which one should we be following? This one seems to be from government officials, whereas the first one is, of course, from more of like a research foundation type standpoint. So which thing is really looking out for our safety? We don't really know quite yet. Another thing that I didn't want to mention while we were talking about the Cook at Home Kitchen video is that before we get into the tutorial on how to cook with crawl, we are kind of flipping through the TV channels and we actually see the ID of Vincent. and it says that the CSIS is actually looking for Vincent. And if you don't know, because I had to look it up myself, the CSIS is actually a real-life foundation that was formed in the 1960s, and they focus on international policy and global issues and things like that. So why are they looking for Vincent? Maybe Vincent saw something that he knew he wasn't supposed to see. Maybe he actually saw a mimic, and now he's missing, and this government agency is looking for him. Also, I didn't really know where to put this, but the fact that Christopher is talking about being more scared of a serial killer, or like that's the first thing that comes to his mind, versus we could literally be attacked by a mimic right now. They could be hunting us in this dark environment. The fact that he immediately goes to killer versus mimic makes me think that in 1983, they were not worried about this global thing that's happening just 3 years later in 1986. I just think that's very interesting that in 3 years, it just kind of grew into this outbreak that is uncontrollable. One little thing that you might have picked up on as well that I'll just touch on is this video of Janice kind of being hunted and killed by the mimic is definitely a continuation of the footage we saw in that documentary of the person being hunted by the mimic. So we can see that everything is kind of connected. We just need to figure out how it all fits together. All right, we are moving right along to my favorite video in the series thus far, and this is Species Anomaly Report. I just want to take a minute here to say, if I haven't made it abundantly clear, that Darian has an amazing series, but this video specifically, such a true horror. Like, it could stand alone by itself. If you don't watch this whole series, I would understand, but go watch this video. We open with somebody typing a report about how the harvester population has increased between the month of August and October of 1989. We then cut to a very uncanny valley photo of a family, and then we start to get bits and pieces of a story. And we can tell that a couple of people appear to be outside in the woods playing and having a good time. We see tendrils slowly creeping in, and then it cuts to static and we get the distorted scream of a child. We see footage of somewhere extremely dark and wet, and dark red kind of floods into the screen. And then we get the most jarring image I've probably seen on YouTube, and it is footage of a child's face basically melting off. This video is not for the faint of heart because the child's scream is like so heart-wrenching, and the effects are very well done. I do have to say that. We cut back to the family portrait, only this time one of the children's faces is very dark and distorted. And then we're immediately taken back to our scene and we see somebody lying on the ground motionless. Then the screams start again and we see a skull just covered in red, and then we go back to the family portrait again, and now we see that the mother's face is also dark and distorted. And that is it. Short, sweet, and fucking horrifying. So let's talk about a few things before we move on. The first thing is that in the beginning of the video, we see a map with the harvesters, and we can see that from August to October, they are, for an unknown reason, moving closer and closer to the Hudson Bay. And in my opinion, this is obviously the footage from the family that was attacked by harvesters, and we already know that the authorities tried to cover this whole thing up. So this is just probably one of many, many brutal deaths that have occurred from these harvesters. All right, moving along to something a little bit more light in comparison to our last video, we are going to be talking about the flavor enhancer commercial. So right away we learn that the New Trier company was established in 1990, and this flavor enhancer product that just came out earlier in the year is actually just selling off the shelves. Never seen before. The demand is extremely high for this product. Then we flip through a number of segments talking about how the flavor enhancer makes your food a lot better. It just makes it so fucking good, and everything seems relatively normal until we get to our very last segment. This ad just shows like a piece of plain white bread, and somebody's just pouring a shit ton of flavor enhancer on it. And the announcer is telling us that we need this product to eat our food and to just add a little bit more.
Just a little more. It It is crucial to everyday eating.
Then everything just kind of devolves into chaos. The announcer's like, you need this to enjoy your food. You must have it on all your meals. You want to buy it. And there's like hands reaching towards the product, and it's giving zombie apocalypse hardcore. Let's talk about this logo just a little bit, because to me and to many other people that have watched the series, this logo looks like a monolith's head just turned the opposite way. And we know that the singularities are kind of spherical shaped. So to me, it looks like a monolith head inside of a singularity. And I'm probably stating the obvious here, but I'm just trying to cover all of our bases. I think that there is something within this spice, within this flavor enhancer, that is making people addicted to it or brainwashed in some kind of way. And you can kind of tell this obviously by the hands grabbing towards the product, but also because the company has only been open from the beginning of 1990 to now. I think it's maybe like the end of 1990, and their sales have increased exponentially. So I think there's definitely something going on with this spice. So moving right along from that last video into the next, uncover documents, we learned that everything is confidential information within this video, and that the new Trier company actually has a scandal going on where a bunch of their consumers are getting really sick, but they're not doing anything about it, and they completely deny it. We then get a shot of a general, and he has the new Trier logo, a little pin on his jacket. And we've actually seen this general in a previous video. I just didn't know how it all added in when I was writing the script, but we have seen this man before. We then get another shot of a whole group of officials, and they also have this pin on their lapel. It goes all the way to the top, baby. It goes all the way to the top. I knew this company were pieces of shit. I just didn't have the proof until now. The government's involved. Throughout this video, there are shots of what appears to be like fungus or spores under a microscope, and we also get a couple different shots of carpenter ants. Finally, we see a newspaper clipping from a private organization called Carcass, which stands for the Containment and Research Consult Association Society, and they are getting pushback from the government regarding new policies. So now there's a new player in this game. We have the government that's involved, we have the National Living Meat Research Foundation, and now we have this other thing called Carcass. So I think that whoever has made this video for us is telling us that much like a carpenter ant gets infected by the cordyceps fungus, that us humans are getting infected by this flavor enhancer. And furthermore, I think that getting those images of what looks like fungus or spores underneath a microscope, I think that that means much more than you might think. My theory is that whatever is in this flavor enhancer, I think it contains the ground up spores of the host. Because consumers getting sick like this obviously kind of lines up with how the host infects people and makes them have very similar symptoms. They're getting just like sick. And I think that there's other ingredients within the flavor enhancer, but I think that is specifically what's making people sick, is the spores of the host. Hi, it's me from the first part of the video. I forgot to say something, and it's very important, I think, to add to the evidence of the flavor enhancer being made of spores. When they're talking about the host, I actually missed a glitch at first. And within this glitch, it is dead ass a picture of the new Trier flavor enhancer logo. So I think this confirms that there's a little bit of spores cooking in that flavor enhancer, okay? I think that's important to note. Okay, bye. Our next video is called Message, and we learn that this message was sent from an unknown sender on December 30th of 1990. The video actually starts out with a segment talking about monoliths before it suddenly cuts to the actual message, and it's meant for Carcass. They're saying that they know that Carcass has received a lot of backlash from the government for trying to discover more about the Vita Carnis. Through newspaper clippings, we learn that the National Living Meat Research Foundation was actually formed by just a normal group of students, and they were the ones that made and put out this documentary. We also learn that the government officials found out about this and took it from the group of students because it contained so much confidential information. I like this video because it almost seems like Darian is gathering everyone together and being like, are we all on the same page here? Do we all understand the concept? Because we just get little like flashes and updates of the story thus far. So of course we get that information about the National Living Meat Foundation, but we also get to learn that there has been a prevalence of cult activity and confirmation that everything is moving closer to the Hudson Bay. We weren't sure if that was the area, but now we have confirmation that yes, something sussy is happening in the Hudson Bay. The sender ends this video by telling us that we have all the pieces, we just have to figure out how they all fit together. Congratulations, you've made it to the final video in season 1 of Vita Carnis, and it is called Facility 0. So we open up learning that this is a message briefing for Carcass, and that 3 teams are going to be retrieving crucial information from inside an abandoned mall in the restricted zone. I think we can all agree that this restricted zone is the Hudson Bay, so we can assume that that's kind of where this event will be taking place. A file folder opens and we get to see a page all about the singularities, which we haven't really gotten to learn much about them up until this point in the series. The briefing tells us that the singularities are these orbs that appeared randomly one day, and that 4 of the known singularities have been brought into the facility and the other 3 are continually being researched. The document also states that once all of the singularities are contained, that the mission can proceed. We then go straight into that mission, baby. We are in the thick of it, and we get to see these 3 teams as they neutralize a harvester, and that ends up clearing their way completely, and they make their way into the facility. We see a couple different angles of this abandoned mall as they kind of make their way through, being very cautious. And then as they're getting closer to the target, we can see that they have some technical interference, but they decide to proceed with the mission as planned. And from our briefing on singularities, we know that they can cause some sort of communication interference. So we know that they're getting really, really close to the singularities at this point. Then through our staticky image, we can see that there are 7 orbs in a circular pattern, and there appears to be people below it, almost bowing down to this thing. The team bursts in, commanding who's ever inside to put their hands up, and then we hear screaming and gunshots before everything cuts to black. And thankfully I did end up watching the season 2 teaser, and I'm so glad I did because we found out that this mission was successful, whatever that means. Okay, so I think that there was definitely a cult within this room and they were worshiping these singularities. Carcass was able to go in there and maybe shoot down all of the cult members, and that is why their mission was successful. I could definitely be wrong, but that's kind of my opinion thus far. And I don't know if this means anything, but in the credits, there's a hint that we have a new player in this game, okay? And the character name is Eyes. I don't really know what that means, but we do see that when the 7 singularities are together, they make this little shape, almost like an eyeball. So I don't know if that means anything, but that's just the thought I have. So if you've watched this series before, you're probably looking at the runtime and being like, this video is almost over and I don't know when she's going to talk about it. But I'm talking about it right now. I'm saving it for the end because I think it kind of brings everything together. So in most of the videos, there are glitches, as we know. But at the end, if you wait till the very end, you get a little treat because there are actually little storybook pages. And if you go frame by frame, it forms a whole ass storybook. So I'm going to be going through and just reading all of the pages that we have so far, and then I'll kind of try to analyze it as best I can. It's important to know here as well that I think Darian intentionally put in words that are unreadable just for, you know, some spice, some zhuzh. It might sound a little choppy, but that is purposeful. Once upon a time, there was a distant kingdom. The kingdom was king, queen, and the prince. The royal family were magical. They traveled to land and sea to discover new places and learn what. During a great storm struck. It was so powerful, it swayed the boat the royal family rowed and pushed the prince out and into the sea. After being stranded at sea, the young prince eventually was cast to an island. Injured, the prince stumbled his way into a nearby cave. The prince used what magic he could to put himself into a healing sleep. But the prince's sleep was long. He slept for what seemed like forever. As he slept, the land around him changed and grew. It was unrecognizable from when the prince first arrived. But the sleep still needed time to heal the prince. Much more time. But it kept the prince safe as he rested, guarding him from the elements as the land changed. During a time of hardship lived the island critters. The critters were struggling in this hard time. There was barely any food to go around. They would go and gather whatever they could. Although one day, the critters found the cave while searching for food. They found the prince in a trance in his healing sleep. The critters were so awestruck and enchanted by the prince's magic. Who is this creature? Why are they here? Are they dangerous? A thought was brought up. What if this creature could use his magic to help them? It may grow food or heal sickness. They continued to argue about the prince and his magic. By the end, the majority of the critters agreed that the prince was dangerous and should not be meddled with, although the other critters ignored the rest of the kind fellow. Instead, they secretly visited the slumbering visitor. They snuck what little food they had and fed it to the prince, greatly hastening their recovery. One day, the prince awoke suddenly. Thanks to the critters' assistance, the healing process had finished very quickly. The prince had fully recovered and was now fully awake and aware of their surroundings. Surprised by the sudden awakening, the critters ducked and hid from the prince's sight. One of the creatures built up the courage to meet the now awake stranger. They crawled to the prince's side and extended their hand in friendship. The prince reached back, and together they had formed the bond that would change their fate. The critters led the prince out of the cave, up to the top of the hill the prince had laid under, and showed them the forest. This is our home, full of wonder and beauty. Although the forest struggles to provide for all us critters, and we are facing disaster. Can you help us? The prince stood back, spread his arms, and before him grew a bright light. Mystical shapes and colors, lights and figures. The critters watched with wide eyes. Such sublime brilliance. The prince completed his display. He vowed with the power he had and the help of his kingdom, he shall heal their home. The prince gathered what he could and then set sail onward. Once the prince returns home, he will come back to the island and return to the critters. So I don't think we have the completed storybook quite yet, but to me, this almost seems like a creation story. The creation of the Vita Carnis, if you will. And I think that the prince represents the singularity, or maybe the Vita Carnis as a whole, and I think that the critters represent us as humans. I'm actually pretty confident in the fact that the singularity is the prince, because in one of our storybook pages, we can see a little sphere in the corner of our screen, and I think that that is kind of hinting to the fact that this is all tying into the situation happening on Earth. The prince comes to this island to heal, to get better, and he's awoken by the critters. And very similarly, I think that the singularity came to the Hudson Bay in order to maybe escape something or to find a new place to live. I'm not sure at this point. But I think we as humans stumbled across this and somehow woke it up. I think maybe that the group of people that happened to stumble upon the singularity might have actually been the cult that's been mentioned quite a lot throughout the series so far. I think maybe the cult came across the singularity while it was in sort of a dormant state, much like how the prince was asleep. I think maybe worshiping it woke it up. They were able to ask for its help. I mean, the Vita Carnis first appeared in 1931. Maybe, I don't know, maybe there was something going on in this timeline where there was a scarce amount of food, or we were really in need of something. And so we asked the Vita Carnis for help, and that's why all of a sudden in the 80s we're getting this ramp up of the Vita Carnis, because now they've returned, much like how the prince said he was going to return. Maybe the Vita Carnis left and returned, and now is in full swing. I think this also kind of lines up with the cult continuing to worship the singularities, because obviously in Facility Zero, they took out the cult, I'm assuming, or at least some of the members, and so we're slowly trying to take care of this problem that the cult and the singularities caused. I hope that made sense. It might just be a jumbled mess. In my head, it kind of makes sense, but there are so many unknown things, and I'm assuming we'll get more information as the series goes on. But that's kind of just a rough guess of what I think is going on with the storybook and with our cult activity and with the singularities. And that is all I have for you guys. I hope that you enjoyed this long ass video. I had to just film it in 2 parts because there was no fucking way I could just raw dog this entire thing. But I really hope that you guys enjoyed this. Like I said, I've been obsessed with this series. I love it. If I haven't said it enough already, please go watch this series. I'm assuming we'll get season 2 within the next year. I'm so hopeful because I'm on the edge of my seat. I fell down the rabbit hole and I need to just like know more. I need to know about this cult. I need to know about the government. I need to know about it all. Please feel free to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoy what I do. Also, I would love some feedback. Do you like videos like this? Do you want me to do more deep dives into analog horror, or is this not really your cup of tea? Because if it's not, I mean, I'll probably still keep doing it, but I appreciate your guys' opinions either way. But yeah, thank you for sticking around till the end if you're still here. I love and appreciate each and every one of you so very much. I hope that you guys enjoyed the video and keep being the bad bitches that you are. Goodbye, guys.